Carlos, Carlos was asking whether you're going to be able to attend. So say hello.
Hello, Klaus. We crossed paths during the cybernetics conference a gazillion years ago. And so hello.
Let me just give a little context.
Hi, Klaus.
The gestation of this meeting was Jamie Hendricks and I talking about Smith College and the woke consciousness versus the old consciousness and the polarization, and a concern by Jason about we're going through a cultural revolution here of trying to force ideas upon one another. And the question is, how can a system be stable or survive when it's starting to separate into such camps? And in talking with folks on the panel, it became very clear that if we just jumped into whose side is right, we've already gone into the gladiator pit of stimulus response, and we're not able to ask the questions about systems. And the concept that Jamie was fascinated with was Schismogenesis, out of the Navan ceremony, when a culture was falling apart, but ultimately came together through a ceremony. And it's all about information, not the actual physical aspects. And that's why I invited Carlos Sluzki to be part of this, who I met with through Stuart Umpleby, and his amazing work with the Mental Research Institute. Why don't you just give a quick overview of your own 7 years at MRI and your own legacy in family systems therapy?
Okay. I'm from Argentina. I did my first professional years in Argentina. At the same time, I started commuting between Buenos Aires and Palo Alto for 3 years, and then jumped into California. I was connected quite early into the MRI, where, as you know, Bateson was the main influence, but he wasn't part of it. And Bert Watzlawick and Wickland and other people, all the team, Bateson's team. In turn, Bateson was involved with this team a bit by I would say, to start with, by his need to find a place where they would have some money. And so he got into that project at the Veteran Administration Hospital because there was money for behavioral sciences by then, in the 40s and early 50s. The people who maintained that the impetus or the strength for that was the MRI, the Palo Alto group. I was part of that group for a number of years. Ended up being for 3 years the director of the MRI, and until they expelled me, and overstatement. And then my career has been both in the field of family therapy and more broadly in the field of psychiatry. I've been chair of the Department of Psychiatry for like 20-something years in 2 places. And so I'm more rooted in pragmatics than in epistemology, so to speak. My interest with double bind relates precisely to the early MRI people who were part of the Bateson's team. And Bateson's team Bateson himself was interested in exploring paradoxes. He was irritated, of course, with the Nazi solution of proposed by Whitehead of saying you cannot mix class and members of 2 different classes, when in fact it happens in everyday life. And that's related already with the issue of trans in Bali, in which the question of whether um, and in dancing that leads to trance. And I've seen it in Brazil, in Candomblé, where a person begins to dance and dance in circles, and at a given moment is piggybacked by a saint, as they say in Brazil, in those sort of mixture of Catholic and African mesh, which is not different from the trances in Bali. So is the person piggybacked by the saint, or the saint piggybacked by the person? How much is voluntary in that, and how much is happened to them? It is treated by the world as it happens that the trance takes place and inhabits the person. And so the doubt, or the double the trap between two logical levels, being the inviter or being the invitee, being the creator or being spontaneous or being carried on, went on in a variety of studies that they did. No, if you want to put the PowerPoints, Lowell, if you have them handy.
Let me share screen here.
Yeah, the PowerPoint, the second PowerPoint is referring specifically to the different areas of exploration about.
Can people see that, hopefully?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Let me just give a little context here. What we're interested in is what Dr. Sluzki talked about in terms of the logical types of mind, being the big M, and the small mind being my individual mind. So how do parts relate to wholes? Wholes relate to parts? And how does it change? What this evolutionary, devolutionary pathway is, that's the subject today. So please go ahead.
Yeah, and in fact, the notion of metacommunication that was brought and then criticized by that same group, and myself included, relates precisely to that, because of the difficulty of defining what is meta to what. But going to the next chapter, the next PowerPoint, please. Yeah, I was referring to, these are the different areas that were explored by that group. The issue, the guiding dogs for blind people. You have to teach the dog to make autonomous decisions. To teach autonomy is like the statement, be spontaneous, or do make your own decisions, but according to my instructions. So who's in charge? The dog of the blind in walking in the street, or the blind person that uses the dog? That was one of the early questions of this recursivity between who's in charge, what is the real important message. Hypnosis is classic, no? Is the person hypnotized by the hypnotherapist or by whatever, or is it happens only if the person wants and allows themselves to be hypnotized, and then it happens. But this allowance shifts the power decision from the hypnotherapist or the hypnotist to the person. The ventriloquist and the dummy was classic, and during that time, that in the movie Dead of Night, there was a beautiful episode, I don't know if any of you remember, of a ventriloquist that gets attacked progressively by the dummy beyond his own power as he gets crazy. But the most typical interaction between that it makes people laugh between the ventriloquist and the dummy is the issue that the dummy makes comments that are demeaning. What do you think you are doing? You believe you control me? No, and it is, you shift the voice from one to the other and create a strange experience of split between levels of control. The same goes with humor. No? Punchlines generally are when you shift the game, the joke from one situation to the next, to a different one, and suddenly what didn't make sense makes sense. Huh? A guy tells a friend, when I do this, and I do this, and this, it hurts here. So the friends, let's don't be stupid, don't do this and that. Oh, how do I put my overcoat then? So suddenly, pow, the power, the joke becomes clear because these are not random movements, but they are habitual movements that you do with the power, the overcoat or the raincoat. The issue of the message display, which is something that Bateson and Haley wrote about it in several of their articles. Again, the recognition of the message display is meta, or let's say it's covering the interaction and allows to bracket what goes on. Yeah. Dogs play fight a lot. And at a given moment, if one of them hurts the other, the cry of the dog may break the whole game because it becomes, oh, I have an echo. Somebody has may need to lower.
Turn off your mic, except for Carlos. Turn off your mic.
I'm sorry? Okay, so just I don't mind. So the messages displays are very important in daily life also, correct? The classification of our interaction by a frame that is meta to the interaction proper. And so much so that you are bantering between guys and whatever, and then one of them gets offended and you say, no, we were just joking, we were just among guys, and whoops, trying to remind them of the frame. Then schizophrenia appeared as a theme in the life of this group, a bit by coincidence. It happened by chance. It happens that grant where Bateson was involved was at the Menlo Park Veteran Administration Hospital psychiatric component. Was at that time he was working with Jürgen Ruesch, and came out of Korzybski's observations that in his view of the communicational style of people with schizophrenia, he noted that the people would either take things literally, in whatever interaction, or metaphorically, whatever interaction, but they could not shift frames and understanding metaphor as metaphor and literal as literal. Give me your hand. No, I cannot give you, it's my hand. No, it's quite a literal response to what was a metaphor. I've seen it more than once in working. Last year, I was working for part-time in a psychiatric hospital. And in fact, to a young schizophrenic guy with schizophrenia, I was inviting him in into a room, and I told him something like, "Come in, son. I'm not your son." But it was quite literally me reminding me. But this phenomenon occur not only in this specific kind of experimental frame or situations, but in daily life all the time. When when Bateson and his group developed and presented for the first time the notion of the double bind, it was very clearly framed. It was not just saying, look, a contradiction between blah, blah. Would you mind passing the next lower? Thank you. The necessary ingredients, and I'm quoting here the seminal paper toward the theory of schizophrenia. Apropos, toward schizophrenia was published at in the right moment. In a very, by then, the second issue, I believe, of a very, by then, secondary journal of behavioral science that nobody in the field of psychiatry read. However, it took by storm the field, because it happened that the field was very interested in the field. I'm referring different researchers at the National Institute of Mental Health, Eastern Pennsylvania Psychiatric Institute, etc., were very interested in phenomena, interactive phenomena, systemic family-related phenomena about schizophrenia. The double bind situation, the components are quite clearly specified. It's not just a paradox, and we call it as we call it double bind. It became popularized that way, so much so that many early therapists even were saying, "Oh, I put the patient in a double binding situation." Wait a moment, are all this? You created paradoxes, yes. It's used a lot in therapy, but specifically, the double bind situation takes place in a scenario. First of all, in interaction. The situation is a situation of interaction between people. Not any relationship, but important relationship. Relationship frequently of dependence. For instance, between a mother or a father and an offspring, or between an officer and a low-rank soldier, or in a teacher and a student. The more important and intense, the better, because of certain restriction that we'll discuss later. It also has to be repetitive in order to have the effect that is described. The acts are simply two injunctions. They define it as negative. Okay, like you shouldn't eat with your mouth open. Well, inventing something. And the secondary injunction at a more abstract level, meaning at a different logical level, is be autonomous. Now I'm teaching you have to make your own decisions. So you have to want to eat with your mouth closed. Not because I tell you, but because you want to. In a context in which it is impossible or difficult to leave the field or not to respond. A response like a table, dining table at home, well, you can shut your mouth, and that's a good way of deciding to not continue the interaction. But if you are forced by others saying, well, did you understand exactly what I'm saying? No? And you cannot just stand up and leave, or an officer gives you two contradictory instructions when you are doing the military service, obligatory military service, and you can simply saying, fuck you, or saying, refuse to answer. And also, you are unable to clarify because you have been told, for instance, and you don't talk without authorization. Well, so how do I ask authorization to talk if I don't talk? You know, and, or at home, the situation of you don't understand anything, which is a way of avoiding when you ask, do you want me to be autonomous and independent and do my own decisions, or you want me to follow your recommendation? Which is not the same logical level, because there is an act and there is a general overall instruction of how to behave in the world, like be autonomous. So all these restrictions are in the context of these two injunctions that are per se, and that is the package double bind. But the double bind is just a package of which the effect is what is interesting. And it is that if you are exposed to this and with sufficient frequency, either you choose to respond to the literal statement, eat with your mouth closed because I tell you so, or responds to the other, the most general, I'm autonomous. And as an autonomous, you have to do whatever you want and create and be ready for the consequences. And this is a crazy making situation. This crazy making situation is what was the double binding effect. In the course of, that was defined as related specifically to, the response would be a schizophrenic response in which you choose one or another of levels of abstraction to cope with this event. And then you can, if you generalize it, you better don't, the interactive universe becomes one that is ruled by these impossible situations, even though when not all the components are necessary. And that's pathology, correct? The specificity of schizophrenia as an effect of double binding situation was questioned not too many years later, and defined as phenomena that even have to do with education, in which people generalize specific instructions and define it as part of the frame. And then you're talking about frame. So in therapy, it became used quite frequently, the paradoxical intervention that were called, a bit erroneously, but not much, a context emina changes. There was an Italian group that wrote a book about that. The Mara Salvini Palazzoli and her team, Paradoxes and Counter Paradoxes, I believe was her name, in which they were working, for instance, with a first consultation with a family that had a son or a daughter that was anorectic or psychotic or obsessive compulsive, whatever. And in the first interview, they would do the interview, exploratory interview, in front of a one-way mirror where part of the team was behind. The therapist would say, I'm going to stop here for a moment. I will consult with my colleagues and bring you the conclusion or the recommendations. They would go behind the one-way screen and they discuss whatever. And then they would return and prescribe the system, meanwhile telling them, look, we have reached a conclusion that you shouldn't change, that what you're doing is has its problem, its inconvenience. But on the other hand, if you change, but at the same time, this is protecting other other members of the family from other kinds of suffering. So it would be a better idea to not to change. Of course, in a context of change therapy, the statement, don't change anything because change is dangerous, would be dangerous, creates a very particular trance, so to speak, in the family, who at the beginning, the reaction is, oh, what would be the risk? Well, I'm not sure, but maybe will be that father will have a depression or mother will become psychotic. We don't know exactly, but there is, we see danger, inconvenience, serious family inconvenience in change. So you, patient, are really helping the family by doing what you are doing. This shift of frame that defines the patient, the difficult person as the helper, and the others as the one that are being helped, leave the family in a completely double binding situation that quite frequently introduces changes because people begin to change their relationship with a patient who is defined as a helper. So they might begin to say, don't help me so much, don't help me. I can manage myself and whatever, many different kinds of things, which is equivalent to praise the symptom, which says others. There are a number of therapeutic interventions that have the intent of generating paradoxes that force alternative solutions to in the consultation. And in part because the therapeutic relation is defined as a non-symmetrical, as a complementary relation with a person in power, that is the therapist or the therapist team, and expectations and necessities on the part of the consultant. There are some therapists that are very good at inducing confusion in their speech. You hear them talking for 10 minutes and you wonder, what the fuck are you talking about? What is he talking about? When you say, well, I begin to understand that there is some important consideration that take place and the possibility of it. You get into a labyrinth of descriptions that you see the patient entering into certain level of confusion. And as you know, when we are confused, we are seeking clarity, and the interventions that, or recommendations or whatever, or reframing that therapies introduce then are much more powerfully accepted as a way out of what otherwise is a sort of hypnotic trance. So the story of the double bind is interesting and it's complicated. It started by a team of which only one was in the mental health field. It was deductive and produced all these pieces, and those pieces, they assumed that the solution would be some pathology, the effect would be some pathology. It hasn't proven to be particularly useful in the specific treatment of families with schizophrenics or with people with schizophrenia. In fact, it hasn't been useful. But at the same time, introduced this communicational / systemic and view that allowed to analyze interpersonal processes in a much more, I would say, circular way, even though double bind is not circular, and definitely with a communicational optic that enriched the field of therapy enormously, and that continues being the base of work. End of what I had to say in 20 minutes as I was requested.
Fantastic. I would like to open it up for some questions. Let me just give you a response when I was talking to Gregory Bateson once, and he was talking about a family that had a broken wing child. In a sense, this child had the broken wing. And he was saying, if you take that child out of that system, the family will find another broken wing mother, relative, child, etc. So the ability of a system to be like an algebraic formula where we are mere variables. So the function itself, and we are a variable, or as Carlos talked about in terms of the message and the mind and the small mind interaction. That sets a stage for us to think about communications and addressing an issue like Smith College and the polarization. But let me just open it up to questions so we can get fresh in our minds what has been described here. And the last point that he made was, it may not be as much for the therapeutics and families, but in terms of the understanding communications and interactions, it is a powerful insight. So could people just ask questions? Klaus, Bob, anyone?
I have a question, Carlos. Does this thing also have some biological root or neurophysiological malfunction involved, or it is purely in language domain and like a double bind communications and maybe confusion on cognition part?
Well, you are asking whether it has been applied or used in biological studies?
No, I'm asking because in my teenage years, I had a neighbor who has this issue, and he was sent frequently to a mental hospital, but the hospital cannot always keep him there, so he will be sent back. And the community, I mean, our little friends, teenagers, and his father, he's got a single father, will form his contacts that to offer him some kind of a comfort. And my observation was, because he was also a friend of mine, my observation was this thing comes and goes like a wave. And so there are some period he's quite normal. he can interact with us, and we play transistor radios together, etc. And when it happened, when that wave strike, then he lost his coordination, normal communication capacity with anybody else. And sometimes he shout in middle of night and scream, etc. So we have to have a number of people getting together to force him on the bed and give him an injection to put him literally into sleep, not to death, but make him sleep. And the next morning he could be a regular person, and it comes and it circles again. So my question is, it is purely caused by the language environment, or it has some biological or neurophysiological disorder?
In fact, if you're talking specifically about schizophrenia, the big revolution of psychiatry took place not when the double-bind was incorporated, but when the new neuroleptics were incorporated in 1951 for the first time as medications that were controlling or improving all the what's called positive symptoms of psychosis, and in many cases allowed people to return to normality. So there is a biological component, but there are studies that are extremely interesting about offsprings of schizophrenia, of a schizophrenic mother given for adoption to normal families, and some of them, statistically speaking, if your mother or father was schizophrenic, you have a 10% probability of in turn developing psychosis. There is a clear hereditability in terms of possibilities. But in these studies, in fact, it happened that of the 250 offspring of schizophrenia is given for adoption in normal families, again, 10% developed when late adolescence, early adulthood, developed schizophrenia. But they did something interesting. After the fact, they studied, not after the fact, throughout this period, this long research, they studied interactive styles in the families. And you can, there are, like Tolstoy said, no? There are families that are marvelous, there are families that are mediocre like mine. And then there are abominable families that are very, very rigid or very, very chaotic, which are the two extremes, let's say, of that kind of measurement. And all the presence of the expression of the genetic proclivity took place in kids that were raised by families that were extremely rigid or extremely chaotic. So there you have a nice description of nature and interactive processes.
Other questions?
Yes, I would ask, is the meaning here of schismogenesis constrained to one particular notion of, shall we say, the big M as a spiritual activity, perhaps constrained to a few special minds, special individuals with special talents? Or is it something that we can look at as part of general human intelligence? and schizogenesis occurs in the framework of linguistic expressions of human intelligence? Or is it also applicable to the biological components of schizophrenia as a medical expression of disease?
Well, as Schismogenesis, when it appeared, as far as I understand, it was in the more anthropological context that was where Bateson was working with Margaret Mead in Bali and all those things. And then I must tell you that as a word, I haven't seen it maintaining its presence in conversations much. But if you, by Schismogenesis, you mean this tension between the larger mind, culture, and expectations, and etc., and higher level abstraction, and the concreteness of acts, and the contradiction and resolution of that in choosing one or another at a given moment. Well, then we are talking about the paradoxes. I will talk about paradoxes that occur in everyday life and that we manage all the time, either by escaping to abstraction or escaping to concretion, or splitting, that is doing, maintaining two frames. I would say that people who understand jokes better are people who are better genetically endowed, because they are able to live simultaneously in two realities and be aware of the shift and not lose your mind. Instead of getting angry at the one who said the joke, by posing you into an undecidable situation and things like that.
F. Scott Fitzgerald said that intelligence is the ability to hold two simultaneously contradictory ideas in the mind at once. And so we're talking about the difference between being smart within a context, being intelligent between contexts, and you can get double bind, within a smart context because you're holding on to one thing too hard. It's a life preserver.
Correct, and recognizing the context in which you are, and therefore the expectations, which are playing also.
Lowell, I find that comment to be very narrow, and much narrower than I'm comfortable with, in the sense that there are the experiences of people such as those of the Ralph Abraham, a mathematician who has looked very extensively at his own experiences with LSD and geometry. This is, in most people's minds, a schizophrenic sort of understanding of the emotions to turn it into mathematical symbols. So I think a broader notion of intelligence is necessary.
Probably so.
I wanted to make a comment on Lowell's. I think I appreciate that very much, to say that whether I call it intelligence or not, but that people can sometimes move from one level to another, larger and smaller, and had no big problems with that. I think the real problem with what I have always a problem with Gregory Bateson is that he almost exclusively built his double bind, for example, on the representational notion of language. I mean, there is a meta level and there's a level below that, and they should not be mixed. That is Bertrand Russell.
Yeah.
When you think of, for example, Varela, who who at some point said, you know, these paradoxes can be easily resolved by adding another dimension, time. Now, if I was thinking of when Carlos mentioned here these are be independent. Someone said be independent. It's a contradiction, of course, but it's a contradiction only if you put these things together in one moment of time. If you say to someone be independent, then maybe one can say I'm speaking now as an authority. And now I'm giving you the authority and you do your own thing. If you add the time dimension, that is no longer a double bind. But if you cannot do it, then of course, that is a mental problem maybe, or a problem of language, or I would say a problem of a theory of language, that one cannot shift from levels. So I think this double bind is resolvable under certain circumstances when there is flexibility to shift from a higher level to a lower level and up and down. And we do this all the time in communication.
Absolutely. You can, a good example is, say, come closer. You tell a person, please come closer. And yet you can punch the person or telling them, oh, you want me to come closer, but not too close. That's all right. That's you can, and you organize it in ways that are not contradictory, or as you say, when you introduce time, that's how come a large number of kids who were raised by this rigid or chaotic family did not become psychotic. There is some component of that genetic proclivity that probably restricts the possibility of that incursion, flexibility, or the time dimension as you introduce. So, yeah.
Yeah, I agree with Klaus to adding the time dimension will resolve the issue. One of the frequently quoted example is that phrase, be spontaneous. I mean, be spontaneous force a double bind, but if you just add the be spontaneous from now on, then the issue disappears, right?
In the future.
In the future, or in next moment.
But one cannot deny that some people cannot do that. And that is a problem for those who cannot shift levels. And I think Bertrand Russell, I mean, this theory is so solid that he could not get out of it. For him, paradoxes of a level were just unresolvable.
Yeah, absolutely.
Carlos, question. Cybernetics squeezed out into a therapeutic practicality, in a sense, in terms of communications. We are interested in how does cybernetics today, with our 70 years experience, move out into social therapeutics, not just individual therapeutics, but social therapeutics. Do you have any recommendations, guidepost, guardrails for us?
I think there's
well, if I would be a consultant to a political firm that is doing public relations or doing defense of a given candidate against others, I would be very carefully, just to maintain the focus, carefully tracking whether there are contradictions in the statements. And for me, interesting political contradiction is simply when politicians say, the Americans want, wait a minute, Americans, who are you to talk about Americans? But talking about the Americans is a bit of hiding the personal view with to make it untouchable. No? And so a number of linguistic tricks that are being used, semantic ambiguities that are used in order to fascinate, are very interesting, very difficult to disentangle, but they teach us more about the fallibility of human minds than about the good intent of whoever is talking about it. I'm talking vaguely because it's a very, very broad question that if given specific, as I told you at the very beginning, I'm more of a pragmatician. So given a political situation and a consultation about a given event, then I can work with that because I can work. But to move to the next level and talking at that level, I'm not good at.
Well, may I add, I think you are too modest. The point is actually to shift from individual therapy to family therapy is already a move towards the social. That means asking the social conditions that create certain kinds of problems, maybe for the individuals or maybe for society as a whole. But I think that is already the move that I personally think I see in Bateson.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
You added some point, Klaus, which is important. If it has to be solved over time, then it means that we need a kind of calculus to describe it, or a set of differential equations, or perhaps difference equations, so that if you want to go in the direction which Lowell mentioned of a social therapy, whatever that may be, that should be a system, a kind of cellular automaton or so, where you have a calculus behind it running with potentially different rules.
Yep.
Lot, do you want to talk a little bit about your conversation and anticipation in conversation interaction in this context?
Yeah, I think it is easiest to do that. I do that one time to begin then with such an cellular automaton, and then to see how it changes. And I don't have that. I can look it up, but then I need 10 minutes or so. I'll come back.
Okay, good. Other questions? Stuart.
You're still muted.
Muted.
Okay, I think I'm off now. I remember this idea of looking at a larger level. I think Paul Watzlawick was interested in it at a time, and I think he called it system therapy. He saw it as a kind of consulting. This was back quite a few years ago when South Africa was making a transition to letting Nelson Mandela out of jail and then making him president and so forth. And so I wrote a short article, I don't remember what I said, trying to describe the situation in South Africa as an example of system therapy. And I think we went through something rather similar recently in making a transition in the United States. It never occurred to me to try to understand it from the point of view of system therapy, other than we need a different president. Can you cite the recent experience of Trump as an example of double bind or system therapy or so forth?
Communications.
Or the need for therapy, yes.
Yes. Well, it's just perhaps a proof of the strength of the lay prayers of, please let not be the one that is again our president. Huh? So those kind of prayers work very well.
Those prayers are
Well, can I respond to this, to what Stu mentioned in terms of therapy, social therapy? One of it is actually teaching people maybe not to accept authorities or give away their agency to authorities. If I see, for example, Trump's so-called power is not his power, rather than the many subservient people that say yes, 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 and will do everything you want. And that is actually making the whole system a very strange, a catastrophe, actually. So I think one aspect of social therapy, if you want, is to teach people what does it mean to be authority, where does it come from. It comes usually from submission and not from the exertion of power, and shifting the conceptions so that maybe a different kind of society can emerge.
Yeah. I wrote still during Trump a paper on the effect of authoritarian regimes on the mind and mainly on the language of people. As I discovered that first that I was sort of a bit cautious, mainly coming from Argentina, of writing certain kind of things in computer, thinking maybe them they are controlling me. But then from there to deciding not to speak about certain things unless with friends, moves back and reduces the support of narratives that are critical to the government. And if you do that, I think you only end up not thinking about that because you don't have echoes. So there is a phenomena of, in fascist regimes in general, in oppressive regimes, of progressive restriction of the world that holds and maintains your stories and validates them. And in part is your own, one's own paranoia, so to speak, that leads to this progressive reduction. And at a given moment, we become the silent automatons.